Aero development started in 1945 as a machine shop in California. They started small, but got the attention of Walt Disney, and they were hired to design a lot of Disneyland's rides for its grand opening. This kickstarted a marvelous run for aero development, later renamed Aero Hus, and finally, Aerodynamics, lasting all the way till 2002. I contend that no coaster manufacturer was more influential than Aero, and today, I want to highlight everything they brought to the coaster world. These are the greatest innovations from Aerodynamics. Before we start, if you can drop this video a like, I'd appreciate it. It helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. Number 10. The Electric Winch Launch. You could argue this should be a lot higher. After all, Screamin' Demon at Kings Island was possibly the first launch coaster to open to the public. I'm not really sure about that. There were 6 launch coasters that opened in 1977, and the opening dates aren't clear for all of them. Aero wasn't alone here. Schwarzkopf had their own launch model open, also a shuttle loop. They used the weight drop, and there was no drop out of the station. These launches were a lot more powerful. The electric winch launch was more of a push, releasing a cable that powers the platform behind the train, getting the train out of the station and down that drop into the loop. This one was also set up on the other end of the track, so it would launch the train backwards. This style of launch was only used on these Aero shuttle loops, with the one exception being Star Wars Hyperspace Mountain at Disneyland Paris. Number 9. The Mine Train. Aero was designing rides for about 20 years before they got serious about coasters. They hit a gold mine with their Mine Train model. The first one went to Six Flags Over Texas, and they went on to build 16 between 1966 and 1997, 11 of those coming before 1975. This was a must-have for parks just getting their start. Magic Mountain, Great Adventure, Carowinds, Six Flags Over Mid-America, now known as St. Louis, and Six Flags Over Georgia. Other, more established parks also wanted in on the action. This includes Cedar Point and Hershey Park. These are usually train-based, low-speed, family-style coasters, and in the late 60s and early 70s, it was the best steel coaster on the market. These were big draws for their parks, usually the star attraction, and they were big for Aero as they were building their brand. Number 8. The Log Flume. Aero is credited with the first modern log flume, but they did not invent the idea. Loggers built these to transport wood downstream, and sometimes they'd even ride the logs. Aero turned this experience into a ride, with a continuous current pushing the logs along. Their first one opened in 1963 at Six Flags Over Texas, called El Aserradero. They dominated the log flume market for about 15 years. Then other manufacturers like Mock Rides and Reverchon joined in. In 20 years, Aero had over 40 installations. Like the Mine Train, these became a staple for up-and-coming parks, and they were even cheap enough for smaller parks to enjoy. These are simple rides, often following a train layout, and they finish with a big drop. This offered its park another major attraction. Number 7. The Teardrop Loop. The vertical loop was nothing new in the 1970s. These were introduced back in the early 1900s, but they didn't really work out. The G-forces were too strong pulling into the loop, and the cars would slow down too much at the top. The idea was shelved for decades. By the mid-70s, both Aero and Schwarzkopf were working to reinvent the vertical loop. Both were successful, but they did it in their own way. Schwarzkopf went with a much more circular design, similar to the loops of the olden days. Aero thought it would be better to make a teardrop-shaped loop, more elongated from top to bottom and less of a perfect circle. This would reduce the amount of time the rider would be upside down, but that would also mitigate the forces on their body. Their first loop was on Corkscrew at Cedar Point, opening in 1976. They would use this teardrop loop on all their loopers till the end, and other manufacturers adopted this model. Intamin, B&M, Vekoma. These all used the Aero design more so than the circular Schwarzkopf design, but even then, the later Schwarzkopf seemed to be less round and more elongated also. Number 6. The Fourth Dimension Coaster. Aero's last stand was a great one. They really went out with a blaze of glory. Before X opened at Magic Mountain in late 2001, no coaster had ever placed its riders on the side of the track. To make it even more crazy, the seats would spin on their own axis, controlled by an extra set of rails on the track. This was very ambitious, and it was the final nail in Aero's coffin. This drove them into bankruptcy. Even though Aero couldn't see this design into the future, other manufacturers did. S&S took over their plans and built 2 more of these 4D coasters, then used the idea for their free spin. This also inspired the Intamin Zaxspin, the first one opening 5 years after X, and that same year, they built their one and only fixed wing coaster in Furious Baco. B&M also has their own fixed wing model, making its debut in 2011. They can all thank Aero for having the vision of putting riders on the side of the track. Number 5. The Suspended Coaster. Aero didn't come up with the idea to put riders under the track. There were a few of these back in the early 1900s, but like the vertical loop, this idea disappeared for decades. In 1981, Aero brought it back. They opened the Bat at Kings Island, with cars hanging from the track, free to swing side to side. Aero thought if they didn't bank the turns, the cars would swing more. This was correct, but they didn't consider the stress it would put on the track. The bat would only last parts of 3 seasons, and they went back to the drawing board. They re-emerged with 2 installations in 1984, and they would build 7 more through 1993. This model wasn't spread far and wide, but this inspired other manufacturers to take their own approach. B&M figured out how to make it go upside down. Intamin figured out how to launch it. Vekoma started a very successful line of family coasters with riders under the track. We can thank Aero and Kings Island for taking a chance on this risky model, and they did feel the pain as they worked out the kinks, but it was well worth it. Number 4. The Hypercoaster. Before Magnum XL200 opened in 1989, it seemed like the coaster world was on the verge. Misho Amusement Machines built Moonsault Scramble in 1983, a 230-foot shuttle coaster. In 1988, Togo built Bandit at Yumuriland. This has an elevation of 256 feet but an official height of 167 feet, featuring a long layout without inversions. Just hills, turns, and a helix. A very traditional hypercoaster layout that we know today. But it was Aero and Cedar Point that finally took the full circuit coaster over 200 feet. Magnum only has a drop of about 195 feet, but they took that model and broke their own height record 3 more times through 1994. Togo followed up with their own hypercoaster. Then Morgan followed. Intamin and B&M joined the fun in 1999, and mock rides arrived in recent years, with Vekoma's model coming soon. Number 3. The first modern inversion, the Corkscrew. The Corkscrew itself isn't that groundbreaking, but when it was introduced in Knott's Berry Farm in 1975, everyone took notice. This was the first coaster in well over half a century to take riders upside down. After years of wooden coasters and mine trains, this was a radical experience. Corkscrew opened at Knott's with 2 inversions, back-to-back corkscrews. Aero was all alone in 1975, opening 4 of these, and they were joined the next year by Schwarzkopf, then Vekoma, Hopkins, and the floodgates were open. From that point on, the vast majority of Aero's projects had inversions, and that leads me right into the next point. Number 2. The inversion records. Like I said, as soon as Aero introduced the first inverting coaster, other manufacturers followed quickly. Aero wasn't about to be drowned out in a crowded field. They worked hard to stay one step ahead of everyone else. We saw this by Aero breaking the inversion record 5 times over the next 13 years. Corkscrew at Knott's opened up with 2, and the next year, Corkscrew at Cedar Point opened with 3, adding a loop to those 2 corkscrews. 4 years later, Carolina Cyclone at Carowinds added another loop to make 4. 2 years after that, Viper at Darien Lake added a double inversion called a Batwing, bringing that total to 5. 4 years later, Vortex at Kings Island opened with 2 loops, a Batwing, and 2 corkscrews. Finally, 2 years later in 1988, Shockwave at Six Flags Great America opened with 3 loops, a Batwing, and 2 corkscrews. This was as far as Aero would go. They set the standard at 7, and everyone else caught up to that mark but wouldn't exceed it until B&M built DragonCon in 1995. Aero's continual push to make rides bigger, longer, and loopier raised everyone's game, and they advanced the coaster world way faster than it otherwise would have. Before we get to number 1, let's look at a few innovations that couldn't crack the list. I mentioned the Batwing. This was introduced on Worlds of Fun's Orient Express in 1980, and I believe this was the first element to have a double inversion. You could argue that the double corkscrew is a double inversion, but I don't. This was a great way to add 2 inversions while turning the train back around, very similar to how B&M uses the Cobra Roll today. But B&M also adopted the Batwing, offering some of the most intense moments in the world on their inverted coasters. Vekoma just started using this on their Shockwave models. I also credit Aero with the Hyper Looper. They came close to this on Shockwave, then Viper, but they went straight for it with Steel Bantam, a 225-foot drop and then 4 inversions, combining the most extreme elements of their models. You don't see too many Hyper Loopers these days. Mach does it sometimes, RMC just started doing it, but Kennywood just decided to do it again with Steel Curtain. Aero also invented the interlocking loops. This isn't really a great innovation, but they look amazing. Loch Ness Monster started it. Lightning loops at Great Adventure followed. Then there was Orient Express. To me, this was Aero showing off, and it's awesome. If you didn't build coasters with interlocking loops in Roller Coaster Tycoon, I don't know what's wrong with you. Finally, they were the first to build large-scale hybrid coasters, a steel track and a wood structure. You saw this with some of their mine trains, and some Wildmouse coasters, but they took this to the next level with Gemini in 1978. This wouldn't really become their thing. They also did it with Excalibur at Valleyfair, but this same concept has become very popular for RMC. It made sense for them to put steel track on existing wooden supports, but they've even started building hybrids from the ground up, which is very interesting. Number 1. The steel tubular track. We can talk about all the elements we want, or records that got broken, or where the train is in relation to the track. But Aero's greatest contribution was the steel tubular track. Once this was introduced on the Matterhorn at Disneyland back in 1959, there was no turning back. This became the only option for modern steel coasters, adopted by every manufacturer. The tubular rails on either side of the track made for a smoother ride experience, with the car's wheels wrapped around on 3 sides, and these were better able to contour around curves, and ultimately, traverse inversions. RMC has gotten away from the steel tubular track, introducing their iBox track and their single rail track. But for over 50 years, the tubular track had a monopoly on the steel coaster world. and it's still by far the dominant weapon of choice. RMC just has to be different. That's a wrap on the innovations of Aero. This was pretty coaster-centric aside from the log flumes, so if they did anything else of note, let me know in the comments below. How would you have changed this list around, or dropped something off in favor of something else? Again, leave all your ideas in the comment section. Before you go, don't forget to drop a like, and if you're new here, give me a sub. Also, check out my links below for my Discord server, and my second channel where I post copyright-free off-road footage, and my baseball channel if you're a baseball fan like me. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.